Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Exploring the Spectrum. Today, we have with us Dr. Greg Chasson, who is a full professor and licensed and board certified psychologist at the University of Chicago and is one of the world's leading authorities on transforming compulsive and impulsive behaviors. Greg is the author of an award winning leadership book on perfectionism called Flawed: Why Perfectionism is a Challenge for Management. And he joins us today for a discussion about how to recognize and navigate perfectionism. Welcome, Greg.
Thanks for having me. Very excited to be here.
I am really excited because we met at an autism conference, but your work expands way beyond to pretty much everyone. Somebody that's listening either will recognize parts of this in themselves, in someone they love, in someone they work with. And I think there's a lot of useful information that we can cover today. And to start, can you share a little bit about your inspiration for the book Flawed?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a question I get quite a bit because people often think, oh, you must have this condition if it's so interesting to you. I also work on hoarding disorder, for example, and people always ask me what my house looks like. So it's a very common question. And really, I would be lying if I said I didn't struggle with my own level of perfectionism, particularly as I was developing and growing and becoming a professional. And so it is something that I've experienced personally, and then that has led into me experiencing a lot of it professionally and how to work with it and how to deal with it. But I remember very early struggling with perfectionism. I remember very vividly drawing a picture of Spider-Man. I don't remember how old I was, maybe 9 or 10. And I was really getting into it, very excited, and I got to the part where you're supposed to draw the webbing on the costume, and I don't know if you're familiar with the Spider-Man costume, but it's a very specific geometry to how the webbing looks, and I got really stuck and focused on getting it just right. In the field, we call those just right feelings. You got to get it just right. And I just sat there and erased and redid and fixed and redid. And basically, ultimately, what happened was that I ended up erasing so many times, I ripped a hole in the paper and kept drawing the arms of Spider-Man with this webbing, and it ultimately looked like he had spaghetti arms. I mean, it completely destroyed this picture that I was working on. And that's the irony of perfectionism. You try to make something so perfect that you end up destroying it or making it less perfect in the process. And so I started recognizing this. And then as I was getting older, it got a little bit more sophisticated. I started worrying about what other people thought of me and really concerned about other people's acceptance and perception. And ultimately realized you just can't please everyone and started working on toning down that perspective in my world and realizing that you can't please everyone. You can't control people's perception of you. So that ultimately led to me getting interested in perfectionism.
In your book, you distinguish between a few different terms. So, nowadays people throw around diagnoses right and left, and they're like, oh, it's just my OCD. So, can you tell us where you draw that line between perfectionism, OCD, and just high standards?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I tend to think of there being a lot of overlap, but not perfectly overlapped. And so if you think about a Venn diagram and you think about different circles, I'll start with OCD and perfectionism. I think that they're two separate circles, but there's a substantial amount of overlap between those circles. Right in the middle, you've got people that experience both. But there are people with OCD that don't have a shred of perfectionism, and then there are people with perfectionism and perfectionistic tendencies that don't have a shred of OCD tendencies. And the same is true for um, other types of anxiety, for people on the spectrum. I mean, there's all this overlap, but there are unique elements to each of these. And so I don't get hung up on the diagnosis in large part because perfectionism is something we all fall somewhere on. It's a continuum. So some people have a lot of it, some people have little of it. And my book, Flawed, and some of the things I've been doing to speak and give programs around the country have been more about just the everyday perfectionism that we all might face, either in the loved ones and team members and marriages and our kids, rather than this disorder or any disordered level of it.
And in your book, you kind of paint this picture of generational perfectionism and how perhaps there's been an increase in this. And can you share a little bit about what you discuss might be the reason for this increase?
Yeah, I mean, the research is showing from, research by Tom Curran out in the United Kingdom, who's done some work on this, has shown that there's been an increase in perfectionistic tendencies from generation to generation. So cohorts are getting worse at this over time. And there could be a number of reasons. I do think that the more perfectionistic you get in one generation is going to, in some ways, prime the next generation, right? You think about all the parents that are perfectionistic and the way that they are bestowing that on their children and so on and so forth. And those children then will go on and have similar perspectives and approaches. I also think that the society that we're in is probably playing a role. Now, to be honest with you, there's no clear answer to that question. It's a good one. But I do believe that our current society is feeding the beast, so to speak. I mean, you think about social media and you think about the constant impression management and photos on Instagram and the way that we're projecting ourselves and celebrities and how this can reach just about everyone in videos and podcasts even, right? That we're constantly worrying about how other people are perceiving us and how we're coming across and whether we're doing things correctly. And I think that we're sort of in a turbo society for that right now. And that's probably pushing the perfectionism narrative even harder.
And there's parts that you talk about, like what perfectionism results in. And you just mentioned social media. There's this thing with when I think about kids these days, if you mess up social faux pas, that might be all over the internet or at least throughout your school the next day.
Yeah.
And it creates this, during these very neuroplastic developmental years of teenage years, it creates this risk aversion, which then translates into risk aversion at work. Can you touch on your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that high levels of perfectionism really is associated with risk aversion. You said it well. There's a fear of failure and there's a fear of your actions leading to bad consequences, or as you said, maybe they're going to be out there forever in perpetuity, right? Like you're just something you wrote on the internet 20 years ago is coming back to haunt you. And it's every public relations person's nightmare. And so I agree that people tend to be very conservative and concerned about this. And sometimes that shows up in a workplace. And sometimes that could mean less risk taking in a smart way, which then can really, I think, sabotage and collapse any sort of innovation because you need to be able to take risks and to take a step forward, even if it means that you fail. You look at some of the leaders at the top, and they tend not to be super perfectionistic because they know that they need to fail and iterate, fail and iterate and learn from their mistakes. It's usually when you get to the lower levels or the lower ranks, starting even at the C-suite, right below the CEO, where they tend to be a little bit more obsessive about being perfect and tend to be a little less likely to take risks.
And so let's dive into a little bit about how people navigate their perfectionism. What are their kind of safety behaviors that you talk about? And what are some of the signs that people could look for in their own life?
Yeah, great question. I think the first step is to identify the perfectionism in yourself and to understand what perfectionism is. So, if you'll bear with me for a moment, I'm going to give you a quick overview of what perfectionism is for those that are less familiar with the term itself. It really is characterized by two core features, in my opinion. One of them is this rigid thinking, this inflexible thinking. You are having a very difficult time pivoting away from things, from changing your mind, from, you know, basically not hitting your head against the wall over and over and over again. And then you combine that with this other ingredient, which is excessive expectations that are beyond reasonable, beyond what's expected, beyond what's normal, frankly. And you could kind of see how these two things can really create a toxic mix. If you are pursuing things that are unattainable and you're having a really hard time shifting gears, you can get stuck and paralyzed for a very long time. And so, if you can recognize those two features within yourself in a given circumstance, it's possibly signaling that you've got some perfectionism going on. And you don't have to be perfectionistic across all things in your life. It really can focus on several important things to you, and it could cause a lot of havoc.
The rigid thinking, excessive expectations, what does that result in? Because I would imagine that makes it very difficult to move forward. And so, what are some of the techniques that people will employ to avoid some of the negative feelings that this rigidity causes?
Well, there's a lot of things that they do. As you indicated earlier, you said safety behaviors. That's a key word in my world because safety behaviors are the behaviors that you engage in if you're perfectionistic to try to calm yourself down, right? So you might engage in any sort of behaviors that are ritualistic or compulsive or even avoidance or escape in order to feel better. So let's say that you have an assignment due and you're very anxious about doing it perfectly. You might end up procrastinating on it and not doing it because you're so worried about it. That's an avoidance strategy. And it makes sense in the moment because you don't want to deal with that anxiety. And so you push it away. Now, not all procrastination is based on fear and anxiety, but a good chunk of it is for a lot of people. And so having to face that is important. Or maybe there are these rituals or extra things that you do to try to calm yourself. Maybe you check it over and over and over again, your assignment, to make sure that you've done it correctly. Or like my Spider-Man picture, maybe you erase and fix, erase and fix, erase and fix until you get it just right. These are the things that you might do as a compulsion. Another common one is reassurance seeking. How does this look? Does this look okay? How does my butt look in these jeans? Exactly, these kinds of moments where you are seeking the validation and approval and making sure that something looks or is correct can be a form of ritual. Excessive apologizing and over apologizing is very common. And this is one I see all the time. I'm sorry. And then they go on to say something that they had no responsibility for. I think we can all resonate with that one. And so these are kinds of things that you do to deal with that perfectionistic anxiety and those worries that you have. And those behaviors, however, can really entrap you. They become bigger and bigger over time and they imprison you because they grow. They get stronger and stronger. And so the more you give into those things in the long run, you're doing yourself no favors. And the approach that I take with people, either individual patients that I see in my clinic or people that don't have a disorder that are just looking for help out in the workforce or in their families, they need to learn how to put a stop to some of those safety behaviors. And that can be very, very difficult.
And you mentioned that it kind of gets worse over time. The more you do these behaviors, the safety behaviors, the more you're perpetuating this cycle of procrastination. When does this most often start?
It starts very early. Perfectionism is something that we see early on. And then learning these safety behaviors coincides with that very early because it's negatively reinforcing. That's the technical phrase for it. I mean, you think about a screaming baby as a new mother or as an auntie or whatever, and you're dealing with your nephew or niece, and they're screaming and they just want that piece of candy. You want to not give it to them because they're being bratty, but then you give it to them at the peak of their tantrum. You've just negatively reinforced your behavior as the guardian. You have just made it so that you are more likely to give candy the next time that baby is screaming to avoid getting to that level in the first place. And so you are going to be more strongly and more quickly engaging in that behavior. And that's what's happening with the safety behavior. You are strengthening those tendencies to escape and avoid, just like you did with the toddler, and they get stronger over time. Now, of course, interestingly, from the toddler's perspective, it's a different type of reinforcement. They're going to scream even louder next time to get the candy. That's positive reinforcement.
Colloquially, we oftentimes hear negative reinforcement used when they really mean punishment. So, can you describe a little bit of what negative reinforcement actually means and what's happening when these procrastination approaches are being used?
Yeah, that's a common problem. It was very disheartening once when I was watching The Big Bang Theory, which is known for its science accuracy, completely screw up the punishment negative reinforcement phrase. And so, yeah, any reinforcement is going to increase behavior and any punishment is going to decrease behavior. So don't worry about the positive and the negative component. That doesn't reference whether something is bad or good. It references whether you are adding a behavior or subtracting a behavior. So positive reinforcement, you're adding a reward, for example. Negative reinforcement, you're taking away something that is bad for somebody. And so ultimately punishment is not the same thing as negative reinforcement. Negative reinforcement increases the strength of the behavior. And so what's happening with safety behaviors is that you are increasing the strength of these behaviors over time because you're removing the discomfort of anxiety, at least temporarily.
And in your book, you talk about this vicious cycle where you're both negatively and positively reinforcing any kind of procrastination, because by procrastinating, you're reducing the negative feeling of having to do a project that you think you're not going to be good at or you don't know enough about. And then you're positively reinforcing the thing you do instead that you
Right.
actually enjoy.
Right. If I go to the beach instead of working on my work assignment, I've just negatively reinforced the going to the beach because the anxiety is being avoided. I just avoided a negative experience, but also I get the excitement of going to the beach, which is a very positive, rewarding experience. So I've just got a double whammy.
So tell us a little bit about what somebody can do. Let's say they've recognized this behavior in themselves. What Where do they start?
It starts by recognizing how frequent and intense those types of behaviors are, and then starting to slowly pare them down. And that requires being willing to sit with some of the anxiety that you experience as a result of your perfectionism. It requires doing what we call exposure exercises, where you go and you do things that purposefully are anxiety provoking that might trigger your perfectionistic anxiety, and then purposefully not engaging in all those safety behaviors. And you do this a number of times and in a systematic way, you can start to become more tolerant to those types of moments so that you can develop a callus, so to speak, of these perfectionistic moments so that you can not get so sucked into the negative behavior. Because, if you're constantly procrastinating or engaging in all these reassurance behaviors or doing all this checking and turning things in late and all of these things, it's going to have a very negative impact on your performance. And so being able to develop a callus to that anxiety and saying no to giving in to those safety behaviors can do a world of difference for you or your teams or your marriages or your families, you name it.
When you talk about exposure therapy, can you give some examples of how you would have somebody practice not being a perfectionist?
Yeah, this could be a number of different ways, and it really depends on the ways in which they're being perfectionistic. But let's say that you're having somebody who is very anxious about sending emails. They want to make sure everything's perfect. They're really slow to respond, or they don't respond at all because they're worried about how they're going to come across. You could start doing exposure exercises where you have them make tiny little mistakes in their emails. And you start with something that is relatively harmless from your perspective, but not from the person who's perfectionistic. So maybe they sign off their name, uh, spelling it wrong. I've done this on a number of occasions. Sincerely, Gerg, right? Instead of Greg. And you just sit with that anxiety and feeling like a fool. And you just do these little typos and you make them harder over time to help build up that callus. So maybe you have them misspell a word in their email, or you have them say something that is slightly inaccurate. Now, nothing major, right? These are not huge mistakes. I'm not asking people to leave a sponge in a patient as a surgeon kind of a mistake, right? This is something that you, as the helper, see, or as the leader working with someone that's perfectionistic, see as relatively harmless. But to the person with perfectionism, these mistakes can be very debilitating for them or very catastrophic in their mind. And so working with them to develop a ladder of things to work up to doing so that ultimately they can start to tackle harder and harder things.
You mentioned perfectionism showing up in, them writing emails and how usually this is more global. It can be in different areas, but oftentimes it's more global. And you describe a very interesting concept where you talk about emphasis A, B, and C, and
Yes.
how perfectionists try to do everything in an emphasis A kind of way. And the goal is to move them to live in the B, emphasis B. Can you describe the emphasis breakdown?
So the emphasis framework is my way of approaching task prioritization. Where do you put your effort on a day-to-day task? And the problem with perfectionism is that it can become overwhelming. And so you have three different ways of approaching a task from my perspective. You can either emphasis A it, which is to give it everything you got, 110%. Then there's emphasis B, which is the get or done strategy. Just get it done. Doesn't need to be garbage, doesn't need to be perfect, just needs to get done. Maybe these are for the things that you don't really care about, but you can't just ignore, right? Like paying your bills, right? Or going to the dentist. And so then there's emphasis C, which is purposefully not doing things at all, right? And there's a time and place for all three of these. And what determines which one you use is entirely based on your values and what's required of you. Your values being what's important to you. What are the things that are most crucial? And what are the things that just can't be avoided? So if there are things that are really important to you, maybe it's your wedding, maybe it's studying for the GREs or the SATs, whatever it is, and that's really valuable to you, you can absolutely choose to emphasis A that and give it everything you've got. There's also a time and place for emphasis C. There are lots of things that make no sense to put your effort into. I never answer the customer service satisfaction survey at the end of my call with Verizon. I just don't. And I never open my junk mail. It's just not necessary. Right? These are things that I've chosen not to do because they're not consistent with my values and they're not required of me. Sorry if Verizon's one of your sponsors.
Not yet.
If they are, we could change that to their competitor. But so, but most of the time, emphasis B is what's required. You don't need to give everything 110%. And they just need to get done. They don't need to be beautiful. And it doesn't mean garbage. It just means get it done. And the problem with perfectionism is that they're trying to do everything, emphasis A, everything, with no discrimination about the type of task it is. But that's just not possible. There's just not enough time and energy in the day. And so what happens is that you don't get to things. Things don't get done. They get pushed off to emphasis C. You're not doing things because of emphasis C, but not because you've strategically chosen emphasis C. It's because your perfectionism causes you to procrastinate and push things to emphasis C. Not your values choosing emphasis C, but your perfectionism.
As you're talking, something just came to mind that kind of weaves a couple of these things together. When you talk about values, and when you grow up as a child in an overachieving family, you adopt those values. When you grow up in a culture that values certain things, you adopt those values. And when you go out into the workforce, you are working based on values that were imposed upon you.
Mhm.
And like in the book, you say that these kids who are perfectionists in school, it's fine. They could go all into school. They don't have to pay rent. They don't have to cook their food. And now they're going out into the world and they can't do 100% in each area, but they don't actually know what their values are.
Yeah.
So how do you navigate that?
Yeah, it's very difficult. I mean, you kind of bring up 2 points that are intertwined. One is that we just, generally speaking, a lot of people don't know what their values are. And so often we'll start there, both at the individual level or at the organizational level, and try to figure out what it is that you care about. And a lot of people get confused because they end up adopting things that they quote unquote should value rather than the things that they actually value. And sometimes they might feel ashamed of the things that they value, right? It's money or power or whatever it is. And it can be a very enlightening first step is to figure out what are your values? What do you actually care about doing? Not what do you think you should care about, not the PR answer of what you say you care about, right? To reveal, like people ask me, why did you become a psychologist to me? And I say, my first PR answer was a little bit along those lines of, well, it's because I love to help people. Now, don't get me wrong, I love to help people, but that's really not what drives the engine for me. What drives the engine is the curiosity and intellectual exploration that comes with being a psychologist. The helping people is awesome. I love it, but it is not the thing that I would say got me into this and pushed me through all the hard hours and the dissertation and all of that stuff. It really was intellectual curiosity is my value. So I think being honest with yourself is an important first step. And then the second part of what you sort of bring up is this developmental trajectory. As kids, our responsibilities are pretty limited. I mean, you go through school and you don't have a mortgage to pay for. You don't have a marriage to upkeep. You don't have, the career. And so ultimately, you can get away with giving 110% to a lot of things in your life. The problem is, and I would say around middle school, it just becomes unsustainable. As we get into middle school and high school, we just tend to grow more responsibilities and we start to learn that we can't keep up with trying to emphasis A everything. And uncoincidentally, that's around the time that I start seeing a lot of perfectionism become a devastating, paralyzing experience for kids.
So going back to kids that are growing up in these perfectionist families, in your book you discuss self-oriented perfectionism, which is, self-imposed, it's all happening internally. And for me, it's interesting that we have this increasing rates of perfectionism and how it's affecting us. And then you have this increase in rates of autism that are forcing their parents to shift. What are some of the things that an autistic child forces the parent to recalibrate in their own perfectionism?
Oh, quite a bit. It's a good point. And there's a lot of overlap between perfectionism and some of the things you might see in individuals on the spectrum. That rigid thinking is a common tendency among people on the spectrum, if not a defining feature. And you get a lot of difficulty shifting those mindsets. And people on the spectrum, I think that that can resonate with them. This is why we probably see higher rates of perfectionism in individuals on the spectrum. We see a correlation between perfectionism and autistic traits. And that's not a coincidence. I think there's overlap, a lot like the Venn diagram we talked about earlier with OCD. And so you're right. There's a self oriented version of this where people impose their own standards that are perfectionistic on themselves, which tends to be very devastating for the individual. But then they also, and these are, you don't necessarily have both. Sometimes you project those standards onto other people, and that's other oriented perfectionism. And that can be devastating because it can have a really toxic effect on your relationships. If you're projecting perfectionistic standards on other people, like say in a workplace from a boss, it's very challenging to interact with those people. And it particularly when those standards are ethical or moral. So if you're projecting ethical or moral standards on people that are perfectionistic, you could sound very self-righteous and you can create this environment of sanctimony or self-righteousness. And that could be very hard place to work. Maybe this is something you might see even in a family unit or in a marriage. It can be very difficult to see that other oriented perfectionism that takes this moralism quality. And I think you bring up an interesting point with the autism spectrum because individuals with ASD, their families are in this neurotypical world that they grew up in. And that neurotypical world has a set of standards and unspoken rules and etiquette and culture. And people on the spectrum, it doesn't always connect with them. They don't either see it or they don't care for it. It's not salient to them. It's not important. And there needs to be a shift in the way that families think about and impose these sort of standards and beliefs and culture on individuals on the spectrum because it can feel a little bit like that self-righteousness, like you are imposing these perfectionistic standards that you justify as being the real world on other people, and that can be very difficult for people on the spectrum. And so there's this disconnect that needs to be worked on. It's not to say that people on the spectrum can ignore all of society and culture, but it's also this acknowledgement that maybe there needs to be a little bit of negotiation between, our perfectionistic expectancies of people on the spectrum and their willingness to to abide by that, and whether that's really necessary or we're just projecting.
And, the necessary projecting part is something interesting as well because if you just impose your like the neuromajority perspectives, you might miss an opportunity to nurture the skills that an autistic child may have based on their values and their interests and their principles. And you touch on this in the book about where does perfectionism fit into the workplace? Can you share a little bit about how, let's say, an autistic individual can thrive in
Yeah.
particular workplaces?
Absolutely. So again, this is not a witch hunt. Perfectionists bring a lot of positives to the table, and I want to be clear about that. They tend to be extremely conscientious. It's the number one research backed trait of perfectionism. If there's anyone in the workplace, that's the one quality I would want in them, right? Is this thoughtfulness or conscientiousness. They tend to be loyal. They tend to be very detailed oriented. They tend to be pretty honest, right? These are all things that you see among people with perfectionism. And in the workplace, these are the kinds of people that you want on your team. If they can learn how to manage their perfectionism and the negatives that come with it, their positives and the things that they can bring to the team are irreplaceable. And so they could be your best team players, your best employees, your best family members. So it's not a witch hunt. I don't want you to eliminate all the perfectionists from your life. And in particular with people on the spectrum, and you could leverage these skills to the extreme. There's a company out here in Chicago called Aspiritech, which is a great model for how to basically co-opt some of these tendencies to their benefit. They have a workforce where it's majority of people on the spectrum. Their entire workplace is decked out and designed, engineered for people on the spectrum. It's really cool. I've done a walkthrough. And basically this company contracts with software organizations to go through and look for errors and kinks and weird things in user interfaces in their software. Like people on the spectrum, they tend to zoom in on the details, right? They tend to be very detailed oriented. They tend to be very rule driven and concrete and that this would be a way of leveraging those tendencies. And they tend to be very good workers in that sense, especially if you've offered them the type of environment and flexibility that would be needed for somebody that is on the spectrum. And so you have this entire uh, company that's geared around this tendency, and I think it's brilliant.
And as you say that, I had this thought where if a company is hiring an autistic individual, and this autistic individual has learned to self advocate and knows what their sensory needs are, it may inspire the organization to shift some of their kind of perfectionist ways of like, well, this is how we always do things. And it invites a little bit more, like you say, cognitive flexibility to the organizational structure.
Right. It's interesting, right? Because you would want to potentially increase cognitive flexibility and make it so that people on the spectrum have more comfort and flexibility in their work. But also, you would want to target cognitive flexibility more generally in each individual because people on the spectrum can have a really difficult time with that. So, they may use that sort of detailed oriented nature to find the errors in the user interface or in the software, but they might get stuck on those tasks because of their perfectionism and rigidity. So being able to use the strengths to help, but then also be careful and work with the difficulties that come with that. So it's a bit of a tightrope walk.
We talked about perfectionism, and in your book, you don't go into the extreme form, but can perfectionism then lead to obsessive compulsive disorder? And what causes that switch in your experience?
Yeah, absolutely. That extreme cases of perfectionism can be disordered, whether that's OCD or something else. OCD tends to be the most common way that it can manifest, but perfectionism and OCD absolutely can coexist and be intertwined. But again, not everyone with perfectionism has OCD and vice versa. So it can get severe, it can get extreme. And we work on this, my trainees and I work on this in our clinic at the University of Chicago. These are the severe cases. They come in, they could hardly get anything done. They're highly debilitated, very miserable. And we work with them. And a lot of those techniques that we use for them, we just scale them down and use them in principle for people that are not so severe, not so disordered. And then we adjust them as needed to help people on the spectrum with that as well.
A lot of the book gives really useful tips for leaders, managers, how to recognize perfectionism in your team, in your systems. And you have a program that you now are offering. Can you share a little bit more about that and what your vision for those programs are?
Thank you for teeing up the plug. That's what I was trying to say. Yeah, so we have a set of workshops that we're about to launch. We're looking for beta members for essentially, this is not individual therapy, it's not group for therapy. It is teaching individuals, whether they're consultants or team leaders, project managers, maybe they're career coaches. We're teaching them how to approach individuals with perfectionism using some of the principles, philosophies, techniques that I put forth in my book that are evidence based, that have been used with both really severe cases as well as individuals who are very adaptive and healthy, and how to make things even a little bit better through fine tuning. And so we're teaching individuals how to then approach using this program. So it's a training of the trainer, so to speak, and it's called Flawed Live. And you could learn more at my website at gregchasson.com or flawedlive.com.
And one of the reasons that I think that this is important is that, like you said, a lot of the perfectionism traits or characteristics are present in autistic populations. And in the autistic conversation, oftentimes it comes up the cliff when they leave school, they don't have services anymore, and there's this process of entering the workforce. And yes, you can teach certain behaviors and life skills, and all of that is great. But if the workforce is not catching up to meet people with different needs, to understand some of these traits and how to work with them, then you're really only fixing one side of the equation. And that's not going to move us forward. It's not going to give autistic individuals, even those who've learned all of these skills and self
Yeah.
advocacy, it's not going to give them a chance to contribute. And that need to contribute is a very human need. It's not
Mhm.
just a financial need, there's a human need to be a part of something bigger.
Yeah, absolutely. I do think it requires meeting in the middle from both sides, right? The employer and the society, as well as the individual on the spectrum. I hear a lot in terms of the society or this or the employer or the culture saying we're not going to change. Like they need to meet us where we are. Like you can't change the society. You can't change as an employer. And it's not about changing as a requirement or a mandate. It's more about why wouldn't you want to change? Like you're leaving tremendous people on the table that you're not hiring that have special superpowers of detailed orientedness and being honest and conscientious, great skills that once they've learned how to manage or that you've understood where they're coming from in their neurodivergence, if you choose not to meet them in the middle and to see the brilliance that they can bring to your team or your organization, that's a loss for you.
Exactly. And it's not, some people, resistance to change. It's collaboration. It's figuring out what does the future look like. And I'm reading this other book that had this interesting anecdote. It was a woman discussing a conversation with a principal, and the principal was saying like 30% of the kids have ADHD. And
Mhm.
she was like, yes. And when 50% of the kids have ADHD, your school system is going to have to change to accommodate.
Yeah, right. Yeah. But, putting that out there as a mandate is not I don't think that's gonna work, right? I think you have to show why it would make sense for them to shift. And yes, there are people that are like organizations that are shifting and kudos and credit to them, right?
Hmm.
So yeah, that book is interesting that you're describing. Of course, no book is as good as mine, but that one sounds like a pretty close second.
um, and there's another part of the book that you had this triangle. You had at the bottom, you had the values, and then you had principles and
Yeah.
rules.
Yep.
Can you share a little bit more about that? Because, yes, with autistic individuals, there's this focus on following the rules, but even in perfectionism, how can this manifest? Because that seems like it could get a little messy.
Yeah, so the pyramid that you're describing is the way that I see the world in terms of values, principles, and rules and how they all get confused with each other. Values are at the core, at the foundation of a pyramid, and these are very fuzzy. They're just sort of one or two word fuzzy concepts, right? Like punctuality is a value. I value punctuality. And people like this, they want to be there on time. They feel really anxious when they're not. And at the next level up on the pyramid is a principle. And these principles are also a bit fuzzy, but not quite as fuzzy as values. They're a little bit more in depth, but you can't really achieve them. You can't achieve them and you can't achieve values, right? So, an example of this is be to places on time, right? Be at your obligations and be responsible and be there on time. That is a principle. It built on the value of punctuality, but it's vague enough where you can never say definitively whether you've met it or not. How do you know when you've achieved being to places on time? You can't because there always is a new trial with data to support whether or not you are showing fidelity towards that principle, right? Are you leaning into that principle, or are you leaning away from that principle? And the more you lean in towards that principle, the more consistent you are with that value and that principle. And then on top of the principle layer are the rules. And rules are built on principles, which in turn are built on values. Now, unlike principles and values, rules are very concrete. They're very explicit. You know whether you've met them or not, right? And in a case like this, it's like be to work at 7 o'clock every workday. And you know whether you've met that on any given day. If you show up at 7:01, you failed, right? If you show up at 6:59, good job. You've met that rule. And goals and rules kind of coincide in this way as well. And so what happens with people with perfectionism, and often people on the spectrum, is that they confuse all three of these things. So they'll treat principles like rules where you have to meet them and you have to be concrete about them. And so if someone doesn't show up at work at 7, regardless of what happened, maybe they had a flat tire, maybe, they had to take their kid to soccer, whatever it is, they tend to then impose a judgment on individuals as if they did not, quote unquote, meet that principle. However, you don't really meet principles in the first place. Or sometimes people will become hyper focused on rules, even when it undermines the principles on which they're based. Right. And so a stupid example I give of this is, imagine you're at the community pool. Okay. And it's hard to do right now because it's wintertime as we're recording this. So put yourself at the winter pool or at the community pool, and you look over and you see a kid drowning, and you look to your right, all the parents are on their phones and they're not seeing it. You look to your left, all the lifeguards are flirting with each other. They're not paying attention, and it's up to you. So you start running towards the pool to save this kid, and you stop and you look down and you decide to let him drown. And you might be thinking, what? Why would you do that? And so someone comes up to you and says, why'd you do that? And you say, well, couldn't go in the pool. Says no swimming within 30 minutes of eating. Right there on the rules. And so the idea is that you've become super focused and rigid about the rules, that you've kind of lost sight of the principle on which that rule is based, which is public safety. People don't want you in there swimming after eating because you don't want to get cramps and drown. But what did you just do? You let a kid drown. How is that inconsistent with public safety? So that's an example of where you apply rules so rigidly that you forget and you actually undermine the principles and values on which they're based. Now, that's a silly example. Nobody would really do that in reality, but it's a good example because it illustrates what I'm talking about. And you see this everywhere all the time. Oh, by the way, the eating before you go in the pool, that's a myth. You can eat as much as you want. You can eat in the pool. It doesn't really matter. The Red Cross has debunked that myth, just in case you were wondering.
Um, your book has some interesting chapter titles, and the example about rules and values is, going to the ER, and it's the gunshot wound or raging hemorrhoids. And
Yeah,
if
yeah.
you go first come, first serve, that's not going to really work in an emergency room. Like, you're going to wait in the ladder because the gunshot wound will take priority. And that was also a really nice way to frame that. There was another part that really stood out to me in the book, and it was about process paralysis.
Yep.
And many of us have heard about analysis paralysis, but can you describe a little bit more about what that looks like? Because I think that might resonate with some people. They might recognize it in themselves.
Yeah, so analysis paralysis and process paralysis are very similar. I just decided to go with a slightly higher concept because to me, analysis paralysis was getting lost in a task and overanalyzing the answer, right? But I wanted something that would be broader to also talk about the process. Some people get stuck on trying to figure out the best process for figuring out the answer, right? So it's not just the what's the best answer, let me go through all the details and overanalyze. It's like, how do I even get there in the first place? And so I thought of process paralysis as a better way of thinking about this because you can get stuck trying to figure out the most efficient or best way of going about doing something. Or the other way is that sometimes you get stuck on the order of operations. What's the perfect order of doing things? And so I talk about those two things in my chapter and try to provide some strategies, including how to apply the emphasis framework to engaging in a way that doesn't get stuck in the process.
And it makes me think of the saying that done is better than perfect.
Yes, yes. Done is better than perfect. And, I think that that rings true. And it goes back to emphasis B is probably your best strategy for most things, unless it's really important to you.
And what do you think is, or in your experience, what is the most common reason why people get stuck, why people are afraid to just do the thing and take the action? Like, what's the narrative in their head highlighting?
There could be different things. The common one is fear and fear of failure and making the wrong decision and being responsible for something bad happening, whether it's to other people or themselves. The other option is that less about fear and more about what they think, quote unquote, is right or wrong or what they should or shouldn't do. A lot of should statements in this world of perfectionism, and it reflects sometimes this rigidity and moralistic sort of perspective and what should or shouldn't be done. And the problem with should statements is that they're very rigid and they're universal and they can really cause a lot of problems. So much so that people in the world of psychology often talk about should statements and their toxicity. And there's even funny sayings about it, like stop shoulding all over yourself and stop masturbating, like must and should. So there are lots of fun little sayings that I didn't make up. So you don't have to send your hate towards me, but they're there because they know, like, should statements are inherently problematic.
And it goes back to this idea of should based on whose values.
Right. Exactly. Usually yours, your own.
And I mean, even that, I should be doing this because I learned from TV that this is what a boss does, or I learned from my parents that this is how a good employee does things. Like, I think there's, again, the value of exploring your values is really great, like, especially for perfectionism.
Absolutely. And it's less about doing what you think should be done and instead thinking about what's important to you and and how is that consistent with your end goals and value end goals and trajectory in alignment with what the world around you needs in order for there to be a harmonious marriage between the two.
And this brings me to the beginning when I told you how proud you probably would have been of me while I was doing this whole podcast and figuring out, because everybody says you should do it this way, you should do it this way. I'm like, yes, but I also value my peace
Right.
and my freedom. And a lot of the emphasis B was applied.
It has to be, right? That's what creativity requires. It necessitates that innovation and getting stuff done. A huge level of that is going to be picking and choosing what his emphasis be. And so
I
kudos to you.
mean, the emphasis A delayed me by about 3 months,
Yep,
and then which again led to that emphasis C of like, "Oh, I'm just not gonna do it," and I was like, "Stop, relax, like, just
right.
recenter and move forward in a different way," and this book would have been really, really valuable if I knew to call it perfectionism versus all of the negative things that the brain comes up with to judge the actions or the lack thereof. Um, so thank you so much for sharing this book.
Thanks for I mean, that's what I love hearing, right? That's why I wrote it is can I flip the script and get people to see things slightly differently and to shift the perspective? And I've heard a lot of that from people. And my hope is that it will continue to help people and ultimately trickle down into certain dynamics within work settings or marriages and, or podcasts or what have you.
And so to close this out, is there anything that you'd like to leave listeners with? Any words of advice or direction?
Honestly, figure out what your values are and then use those to determine how to prioritize the things in your life that are most important. Give those things your all, and then everything else should be emphasis B or C. And that includes the process and doing things and how efficient you are. It includes not getting stuck in rules and embracing principles and not confusing all of those things. And it's be very careful with the way that you project your perfectionism onto other people. And if this is so severe that it's getting in the way of your functioning and causing you major distress, it is okay to seek out somebody who is an expert in this to get some help because it can be very impairing and debilitating.
Thank you so much. And where can people find you to learn more or collaborate or find out about the program?
Yeah, great. Thanks for asking. Well, you can find me at my website, gregchasson.com. I believe there will be a link in the podcasts as well.
Yep.
Flawedbook.com is where you can get the book, and Flawed Live is where you could find out more about the workshop.
Amazing. Thank you so much for joining us today and sharing this information. And I hope that people check out the book. There's a lot of really great tools in there.
Thanks for having me.